Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Locals, and Telegram, all of which is in the description box of this video. In addition to supporting me on Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee. And if, we'll check out chats at the end. Super chats will be read first. And also, I have to announce that Terminal Philosophy will not be joining us today because he's sick with strep throat. So today, we're going to talk about the U.S. 2022 midterm elections. So, Logos, why don't you begin by giving us your take on this?
All right. So I think I can divide my take into two halves. Neither side is really happy with how the election turned out. The Republicans thought they were going to get a red wave or even a red tsunami. People are calling it the red ripple. Democrats thought they had a mandate after all the January 6th stuff, all the Trump stuff, that they were going to hold government with an iron grip and finally get their agenda through. People are finally going to see reason. Neither seemed to come to fruition. And so to start with, for the left, right? I'm seeing a lot of lamentations of the Democrats. Why are people voting against their own interests? I even saw a Reddit post from an international person just like throwing their hands up at the whole thing. Why is it that people in your country seem to hate the Democrats? And so I wrote a response to this post. I'm going to paraphrase from to keep it brief here. We have a lot of crazy things going on in the world. We got the war in Ukraine. We got a turbulent economy. We have housing crises. We have all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Now, the Democrats should have the ball here. The ball should be in their court. And why is that? Well, because as far as I can remember, the Republican position on the economy has been like something like this. All economic acts are kind of an act of God, and your success is basically your personal responsibility. You can't be running to daddy government to bail you out whenever you get into trouble, because eventually we'll run out of other people's money, or insert sly argument they like to use here. Now, as far as they have that that stereotype, and they still seem to everywhere I look, people are going to look to the Democrats when we have these crises for something to do and something to manage. The problem with that in this election and the previous election is that Democrats have been focusing most of their attention, from what it seems to me, and a lot of people, fighting the Republicans on cultural issues where they just don't need to. So in Virginia, for example, in 2020, when Youngkin won, on the ballot was parental involvement in schools. How much authority do parents have? What should we be teaching in schools? What's their libraries? And how easy would it have been for the Democrats to just say, look, um, porn material shouldn't be in elementary school libraries. If there's a problem, let's do a joint investigation. Let's figure it out. Let's make it good for the kids. What they did instead was double down on the accusations and said, like, well, we don't think parents have the ability to rationally parent their kids. The state is going to teach them acceptance, diversity, and so forth. And it just like massively made this crazy problem. If they would have just said, you know what, these are cultural problems, let's look into them. Let's focus on where we're strong, like the economy. They probably could have done a lot of good stuff, especially in 2020. The economy was looking precarious. People were looking for some stability after COVID. The Republican messaging at the time was just about, stopping the government spending where people were precarious after having been laid off for COVID and so on. So, but Democrats punted the ball. And I think echoes of that came back in this election too. And the ball got punted again when they ran against DeSantis in Florida and a lot of places like that. It was heavily on cultural issues. So where the Democrats are strongest, they keep punting the ball and people don't like it. I could go further, but I'm going to, for time, switch over. So why isn't the right winning? Why aren't they getting this big red wave if the Democrats seem to be falling into all these cultural traps the Republicans are setting for them, right? You'd think, wow, with the economy, I'll sum up this meme that I heard on Twitter that I thought was just brilliant, just like completely summarized the absurdity of our age. Democrats say this is the most important election of our lifetime. Democracy's at stake. They ran on that. Democracy's at stake. War in Ukraine, bunch of stuff going on. Blah 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 blah. Whole list of things. And somebody says, "Wow, that sounds like a big deal, right?" So is this list of stuff, all of it, is this all important enough for you to finally pretend or stop pretending that men can get pregnant? Democrat just says no. Okay, that's basically the Twitter meme. Now you'd think with all the traps that the Democrats are falling into in this regard, the Republicans will have a leg up. They don't have to talk about the economy where they're considered culturally weaker, and they seem to be winning because the other side keeps getting baited into their cultural trap. So why aren't they doing well? Especially with the economy so turbulent and everything in the mainstream media talking about this being poised as like a referendum on the economy, on foreign policy, places where Republicans or at least foreign policy anyway. Um, well, the problem is, this is something I joked with you about, Todd, when we talked in private last week or a couple weeks ago. I think the Republicans have gotten too good at their own propaganda in the sense that when the Republicans tell the populace that who could have foreseen these economic acts? These are all just kind of like quasi acts of God, and nobody's responsible for you but you. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Stop asking daddy government for help. Eventually, malicious compliance is going to flip that around, and so when the Republicans start running on, look how terrible the Democrats are making the economy. Look at all this inflation. Eventually voters are going to go, I've got on really good authority that my economic problems aren't the fault of the government. So why should I care about any of this squelching about the economy? And if the election issues of the day are going to be wrapped up in cultural issues, sure, why not? And so right when the Republicans thought the Democrats, they had them in their traps and their clutches with some of the most absurd stuff, the ruling on abortion comes around. And so I think people are less caring about the economy because they take government gridlock for granted, and they just have this idea that whether they believe the whole you're responsible bootstraps or not, the government seems to act that way to the gridlock of Congress when it comes to any real change that's going to help them. So, okay, if we're going to do this in culture issues, let's do this in cultural issues. So what are the big cultural issues? Abortion. From what I've seen of exit polls, that was actually a fairly big one. The other one was the war in Ukraine. How the Republicans screw that up if those quote the adults in the room on foreign policy, at least as they like the media to portray. Well, I think this goes all the way back, and you were going to mention something about this. I'll let you talk about that from your angle. I think they screwed up this war on Ukraine thing way back when they first let Trump get impeached based on the Ukraine thing. So let's rewind all the way back.
Don't you mean Russia?
No, the Ukraine thing. We'll talk about this. So basically, Burisma, Hunter's working with Burisma and Ukraine. They think Biden's financing the deal. There was like leaked audio of Biden saying, "Get your prosecutor off Burisma, stop investigating corruption, whatever, or we're not going to give you this billion in financial aid." Trump heard this. Trump calls Ukraine and says, "Hey, you better not do this. You better follow through and investigate corruption, blah, 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 blah." He got impeached for a quid pro quo on that. Okay. This would have been the moment for the Republicans to all rally behind Trump, all of them, get a full media presence, get a full press thing, everything, and say, "Listen, man, this got screwed. Here's how, let's set the record straight." They didn't do it. In fact, they're very divided on it. Some of the Republicans took it as an opportunity to try to get Trump out because they didn't like him. And you're going to bring this up from your perspective as well. Well, the problem is because they didn't have a good narrative on how Biden was incompetent on Ukraine at worst or corrupt at best, because Trump got tangled up in it and some of them wanted to get rid of Trump, they lacked credibility going to this midterm about how the Democrats are corrupt on Ukraine, because they basically let the Democrats crucify their boy on Ukraine way back when, and the record never got quote set straight in the eyes of the mainstream media. They let that Hunter laptop story get buried. They let the impeachments of Trump go through. Some of the Republicans even flipped and went against Trump on it. So how are they going to run as the adults in the room on foreign policy when they let Trump kind of be their quasi spokesperson, and they kind of let Trump get impeached twice over the same foreign policy they think they're going to take the reins on? It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, Keith.
I think there's a lot of different currents that feed into each other on this. But I think that there's one thing that is fairly apparent, and I haven't seen much commentary about this anywhere else. And that is American politics, for good reason, tends to be framed in terms of the conflict between the red tribe and the blue tribe, the blue liberal Democrats and the red conservative Republicans. But based on not only voting patterns in terms of the voting for the parties and the candidates, but also the results of different referendums, as well as what just the public opinion polls say about topical issues, it seems to me that what is starting to emerge now in electoral politics is what I call a purple tribe. And that is, these are people that are not staunch conservatives or staunch Democrats or staunch liberals or staunch Republicans. They tend to be comparatively moderate on a wide range of issues. And they also tend to like pragmatism. They tend to not like extremism. And they have the attitude, we've seen enough extremism. We don't need any more extremism. As an illustration, one thing that can be has been pointed out is that in the elections that on the Republican side, the Republican candidates that had an image of being extremists tended to fare the worst overall. That is, Republicans that were comparatively moderate tended to do better. That was also true on the Democratic side as well. I think further left Democrats did a little better than some of the hardcore Republicans, percentage wise and things like that. But it's also true that relatively moderate Democrats tended to fare fairly well. For instance, someone like Abigail Spanberger here in Virginia, she got reelected. And also, if you look at the referendums on different issues that were held in different states, you see that had kind of a centrist, almost center-left kind of trend to it as well, and that's consistent with the public opinion polls. Like public opinions polls nowadays show that a plurality or even a majority of Americans are, I guess you could say, or have moderately social democratic economic views and moderately libertarian social views. And what I mean by that is, on economic issues, they're okay with a higher minimum wage, they're okay with labor protection, they're okay with universal health care, but they don't want to do away with business or nationalize the economy, or they don't want wild Thatcherism, but they don't want Hugo Chavez either. So this demographic that I'm talking about now has fairly centrist, populist, reform liberal, perhaps, moderately social democratic economic views. And they also have moderately libertarian social views, in the sense that they're okay with gay marriage, they're okay with marijuana legalization. Both of those poll at almost 70%. They may be moderately pro-choice on abortion, moderately in favor of gun rights on the other side, but they don't want total deregulation of all this stuff. They don't want zero regulations on guns. They don't want zero regulations on abortion. They don't want zero regulations on, say, transgender surgery for children, and they don't want things like totally opening the borders and totally abolishing the police and stuff like that either. So they don't want these far left positions, but they're not really conservatives either. That point of view seemed to be expressed to a greater degree in the elections than what I have seen in the past. And it's consistent with what a public opinion polls show, and it's consistent with what both partisan elections and referendums showed. And I think one thing that feeds into that is age. I think that now we're starting to see more Gen Z people and late millennial people vote in a way that we didn't before. I think multiple things probably motivated younger people to vote, as opposed to in the past. Like, young people are notoriously non-voters, but there was a disproportionately or an unusually high turnout among young people in this election. And I think there was a lot of things that fed into that. One of them was Biden said he was going to forgive student loan debt. Whether he does or doesn't is another issue, but that's what he said. Another thing is, for young women, the abortion issue. The majority of young women are pro-choice. Another issue is marijuana legalization. So the Democrats got the pothead vote. Another thing is the aftermath of the George Floyd protest a couple of years ago. I think a lot of younger people got really motivated to get into politics because of that. Another thing is the impact of the pandemic and its economic effects. I think a lot of younger people are worried about the impact of all of that. So for various reasons, really a long list of reasons, you had more young people voting. And I think that generation, that late millennial, early Gen Z generation, people who were born somewhere between 1990 and 2002 or no, see, 2004 or something. People born in the 90s, basically, or early 2000s. I think that now that that generation is starting to vote more, you're starting to see a purple tribe emerge that represents that generation's value system. The research shows that the red tribe is disproportionately old people. Certainly not all old people, but for instance, Fox News viewers are on average something like 68 years old or something. The blue tribe tends to attract younger people more. It tends to attract social groups that are historically outside, historically marginalized, black people, gay people, and all of that. But there does seem to be a purple tribe that's emerging that's not super woke. They're not on the far left. They don't want to have the death penalty for hate speech and things like that. But they're not conservative either in the conventional sense. They're more pragmatic. They're more, enough extremism. Let's just have universal health care and legal weed. But no, we can't abolish the police. We can't totally throw the borders open. We can't totally deregulate guns. That seems to be a common thread throughout the entire electoral pattern, and public opinion polls back it up.
All right. So some of my thoughts on this as what's interesting is in this election cycle, it would seem never has so much money been spent for so little result. Something like $7.6 billion has been spent total. So that's both Democrat and Republican. And this was something that I was getting from Chuck Todd on MSNBC. This was 4 days ago, so it could be a little out of date. But he said no Senate incumbent seat was lost and just one governor lost in Nevada. So again, that could have changed in the last 4 to 5 days. But a lot of money was spent that didn't really move the needle. And I think what that indicates is that a lot of people, I've in other streams have often made reference to the Christmas Carol where the ghost of Christmas future tells Scrooge, if you persist in a certain course long enough, your destination will be predetermined. And I feel like a lot of people have been in these sort of like political arcs, if you will, that they're not going to really move anymore. They're fixed. They're in place. They've been in this trajectory for 20 years, 25 years, whatever. Not in all cases. I mean, again, there's the riddle of the big flip where liberals became, World War III hawks, even though they, were against Bush in Iraq. So you can move the needle in some ways, I guess, but that's a foreign policy issue, not a culture issue. And since the cultural issues, as you pointed out, Logos, were the sort of the key things here, I think the cultural issues are more or less dialed in. You're not going to really see a lot of needle moving on those issues because, again, that's the result of 20 years of becoming settled. And furthermore, if it really were going to switch to cultural issues, you'd have to have a full court press by the media and tech companies. And if they do switch cultural values, it's not going to be in the rightward direction, but in the further leftward direction. But I think right now, with issues of the economy, and international military conflict, we won't see that for a while. The other thing is, I think the Republicans, again, they still won the House. So it's not that they, quote, were crushed or lost, and it's still kind of a dead heat in the Senate. It's more like they underperformed. Or maybe a better way to put it is, some Republicans overpredicted, like Ted Cruz, for example. But the thing is that there was a lot of infighting between the rhinos and the Trump supporters, the MAGA. And I think part of it was this infighting led to a weak showing because there wasn't a solid front. One could imagine if a different outcome if they had all rallied behind the Trump MAGA agenda rather than wasting energy sniping at each other. So we could see that. I think another thing too, and this is where MAGA's a little different in this regard, so I'm not including them, but the traditional Republican establishment is associated with, the business class. And of course, Hollywood has been very successful, and popular culture in general has been very successful in painting them as the bad guys. So the Republicans just kind of walk into the bad guy slot default. Now, of course, yes, the Democrats are super wealthy, and yes, they are the business class, but they do a better job of hiding it. They don't go out there and just own it, whereas the Republicans do. And I think that also is going to hurt them in an election like this where the economy is going to pieces. I agree with Keith that young people probably did vote for Biden because of his proposed debt forgiveness for college student loans. Again, whether he does anything or not is another question. And I didn't think about your point, Logos, about Burisma, but yeah, that was really stupid in allowing the Democrats to basically unseat Trump on something clearly Trump was in the right. This is completely unacceptable that this is the case. And of course, the other big thing was that Trump announced his candidacy for 2024 during all of this. So, there's that as well. So, Logos.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what you guys said. Is there a new topic we'll transition to?
Well, you wanted to explore more Ukraine and Burisma, right? Or the infighting amongst Republicans, rather. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I already kind of summed it up at the beginning, but if you go back to Trump's impeachments and think about what they are over, I think he was impeached twice, maybe 3 times. I lost count at this point. It's been a lot. And one of them, I think the most relevant one for the midterms one, was when Trump went after Ukraine and they basically accused Trump of trying to get a quid pro quo on Ukraine when it looked to me like he was going after Biden for having already done so. But I mean, if we're talking about the war in Ukraine, then I mean, what's going on here? Here's something else to talk about too, is what exactly is the Republican policy of the war on Ukraine? The Democrats are pretty clear, right? If nothing else, you know what the Democrats believe on the issue, really. There are some fringes on the party that are basically not even Democrats anymore, like Jimmy Dore, but he's more associated with the People's Party and people of that camp. But the mainstream Democrat position is just keep giving them materials, keep giving them money. Russia must be driven out. It's like, okay, you know where the Democrats stand on this issue. It's like, what do the Republicans stand on this issue? Well, it depends on the Republicans, right? So like some of the Republicans are like libertarian, Ron Paul-esque, not our problem type Republicans. Some of the Republicans are like, yeah, we'd like to help Ukraine, but we're questioning all this tax money on the back of this other inflation that we've got from COVID. And so they're getting things kind of twisted up with the economic issues they already have. And some of the Republicans are the more traditional, like war hawkish Republicans. But what gets even more confusing is you already have some of the more war hawkish Republicans, the 200 of them that backed Biden when Biden ran for president, and that more or less kind of defected from the Republican Party. And so if the Republicans have the same message as the Democrats, aside from some of their news sources, it's not clear that's like the party's position. And when you're talking about like general House and congressional seats and whatnot, you'll have different messaging across the board. Each candidate can be a bit different based on that. And so if foreign policy is something you care about in determining your vote, it's not clear what giving a Republican majority or mandate in Congress will accomplish exactly. If you care about Ukraine, in quotes, the way the Democrats care about Ukraine, you want more relief funding to them. It's not clear that Republicans will get that for you because of all the skepticism they have of all the checks and all the inflation and so on. If you are against the Ukraine war, it's not clear that getting a Republican majority in Congress will stop this, or sorry, against our funding of the war, because it's not like we have direct control over it, whatever. It's not clear that getting Republicans in Congress will stop that because a lot of Republican news sources like, say, Newsmax or Fox are basically gung-ho on the same narrative the left is, even if some of the candidates are kind of divided on it. But how divided is divided? So there's no market niche on Ukraine that isn't already being captured. Add that to the fact that the competency problem we already talked about with Trump is just an anchor weighing them down. They had their chance to make Biden and the Democrats look weak and feckless and whatever on the issue because of Biden's dealing. They dropped the ball, let the media completely control the narrative, did nothing about it, and now they kind of want to step back up and say, well, actually, we object. It's like, well, it's 2 years too late to object. You're objecting on the eve of the election where people's attention spans already driven in thousands of different directions. This is something you would have had to hammer over years each time a news cycle came up, and you just didn't do it.
Right. And to that point as well, the Republicans, which are typically perceived as a party that's strong on law and order and foreign policy, Biden outflanked them on both, right? Biden is literally ratcheting up for World War III with Russia, so it's kind of hard to outflank Biden on that front. The only thing you could do is play the peace card, but as you said, Logos, the Republicans are divided on that, right? You've got the MAGA Republicans and the Libertarian Republicans that are opposed to this conflict, and you have essentially the rhinos that aren't. and they're totally for it. And so, this is where it gets interesting. And the anti-war party in the Democrats is completely gone. It doesn't exist at all anymore, if it ever truly existed. I remember there was a Reason TV documentary video episode like back in, well, I don't know, 2009, that said that the anti-war movement was the anti-Bush movement, because when Obama was ratcheting up in Libya, they're just like, yeah, this is just the anti-Bush movement. And so, with this the position on the war, yeah, the Republicans haven't really given a consistent narrative. Now, of course, I'm in favor of the sort of like libertarian MAGA Republican anti-war position. In fact, I think you would agree with me with this, Keith. The only real issue in American politics right now is, do we have World War III or not? And the real issue is stop World War III. That's the only issue that matters right now. All the other issues don't, and people haven't seemed to get the memo on that yet. Keith Preston.
Well, I would certainly agree avoiding World War III is the number one issue, but I don't think voters generally saw it that way. In fact, just the opposite. There are very few foreign policy first voters, even at a time like this when you have rising international tensions. As long as people don't think they're going to be the victim of a terrorist attack or drafted into a war like Vietnam, they don't really care about foreign policy. That's just a standard brand aspect of American politics. There was an article that Joel Kotkin wrote recently. It was before the election, but he was talking about how the real conflict in American society culturally was not between the red and the blue, but it was between people with pragmatic views and people with extremist views. And that overlaps with what I was saying earlier about the rise of this purple tribe that I've identified. I think that's what, to a large degree, what we saw in the election. We saw that the anti-extremists struck back, so to speak. There was an article like that in after the election in the Atlantic by Joshua Monk, who argued the same thing, that the real winner in the election were moderates. And I think that is a pattern that's very readily identifiable. I do think that there are a lot of people who are not interested in the more extreme viewpoints that we've seen expressed in different places in recent years, and you have more people who are voting with the middle in many ways, or what's now within a contemporary context is considered the middle. And as far as topical issues, I as I was just saying, I don't think foreign policy played a big role in the election. Not many people in opinion polls cited Ukraine as a primary issue. As Todd said, it's kind of hard to out-hawk the Democrats on Ukraine. I mean, what are you going to do? Advocate using nuclear weapons or something like that? So that would be a bit difficult. As far as the crime issue, I think there are several things at play there. For one thing, Biden has always been a law and order Democrat. That's his whole career. He's an old school, blue collar Democrat that was always tough on crime. He's never been a liberal on crime. Another thing too is that a few years ago we just had massive protests against police brutality. So I think when the Republicans come along and say we're going to be tough on crime, I think a lot of people say, well, yeah, that means no-knock raids, that means police brutality, that means stop and frisk, all the things people were protesting against just a couple of years ago. So I think that they may have overplayed their hand with that, because the evidence shows that outside of select locations, crime really isn't rising that much. I mean, people who live in rural areas, people who live in smaller towns, people who live in more secluded areas, and even a lot of cities, outside of certain cities, there hasn't been much of an increase in crime. I mean, the increase in crime is basically where you would expect it to increase. And I think that's explained as much by the impact of the pandemic and the economy as any kind of policies related to criminal justice. Criminal justice policy may enter into it, but I think these other things are factors as well. So I think a lot of people just weren't impressed with the Republican stance on crime. And beyond that, Biden himself was saying, forget this defund the police thing, let's fund the police. So he took a fairly tough on crime stance as well, and he's the voice of his party as the president. So I saw an interview this morning with Victor Davis Hanson, And Victor Davis Hanson is a conservative intellectual. He's sort of like the Noam Chomsky of the Republicans, I guess. One of their leading intellectual lights. But he's a staunch Republican. But he was talking about why he thinks the Republicans lost. And one thing he mentioned was that they didn't offer any kind of positive program. They were just saying, well, Biden has screwed up everything. Interestingly, like one criticism that the left often gets is the left is often accused of not offering anything positive. You just negate. You're just against everything. You're anti this, anti that, anti that. What do you actually plan to do about anything? And I think the Republican side had had a problem like that in this election. In fact, early on, that had been their strategy. Earlier in the year, before the Dobbs decision came down, McConnell's strategy that he developed for the Republicans is, we're not going to even offer any policies for anybody to argue about. We're just going to attack the Democrats. We're just going to say, look at Biden. He's screwing up the economy. He's screwing this up. He's screwing that up. And it didn't work. That didn't work because the Republicans became the party that doesn't have anything positive to offer. Whereas then the Democrats did an about face and said, well, we're going to have student loan debt forgiveness. We're going to have, this, that, and the other thing. So that strategy ended up backfiring. One thing that the Democrats also did that worked out very well in their favor is they actually, behind the scenes, clandestinely, were promoting the more extreme Republican candidates against the more moderate ones. They were actually providing funding in some cases to the crazy Republicans on the grounds that they would be the easiest to beat in the general election. And that seems to have been the case, that the further right Republicans tended to do worse in the election than the more center right Republicans. So that was a fairly shrewd strategy as well. The economic issue is interesting because at a time of when the inflation is the highest it's been in 40 years, you would think that would be a decisive factor. Opinion polls did show that was one of the two biggest issues in the election, but the other one was abortion. And the evidence shows that voters for whom abortion was a primary issue tended to be pro-choice voters. So the pro-choice voters ended up negating the impact of the anti-inflation voters to a large degree. Also, on the crime issue, there were people that, crime polled high as an issue that people said they were interested in, but then so did gun violence. So I think a lot of the anti-gun vote who tend to vote Democrats, they canceled out the law and order Republicans. So some of these issues had the effect of canceling each other out. But I think the big picture is that it tended to push things towards the center. You saw where extreme candidates did worse than middle of the road candidates. And the general pattern, like I said, that emerged is this kind of purple vote where, moderately liberal to reformist to social democratic economic policies, okay, not outright socialism, moderately libertarian social policies, okay, not defund the police, not totally open borders, not zero regulation of guns.
Right. And what's interesting too about the way you're sort of constructing this, Keith, with the purple vote, and the idea is that, well, this is what's interesting. This is something I've been thinking about recently, and I think this is relevant to our discussion today, is we really are in, like, for the first time in the industrial West, or I guess you say post-industrial West, living in a society completely governed by economic forces, in the sense that the influence of religion, the influence of kinship groups, the influence of norms of gender are completely gone. I mean, they still are represented, but they're represented in an ersatz form that's been sort of digested and regurgitated by the corporate system. And so they're really not representative of any of these traditional realities. And so, Marx predicted that once you had, this complete rule of capital, then something like his Marxist revolution would happen. In the West, it hasn't happened yet. And in part, I think it's because in the West, we until now had all of those institutions in place. We had families and kinship groups. We had religious institutions. We had a clear understanding of male and female gender and sex roles and identity. They're all gone now. And now we're living in sort of like the pure rule of economic forces, at least from the point of view of capital. And so that's in part why, to the question that you were responding to on Twitter, Logos, American politics is crazy because everybody else is still kind of, especially if you're in Africa or Latin America or Asia or Russia or even Eastern Europe, you're still living in the real world. You can't pretend that men get pregnant. You can't pretend all of this nonsense. You still have to have real politics, i.e., politics rooted in some sort of lived experience. America's hyper reality. It's the hyper real political nation. So the sort of political discourse is completely foreign to anything you'd find in most countries. And I think that the interesting thing here then is one, that it shapes how people vote. So most people are going to care about foreign policy in a sane system because, whether wars happen or not is going to affect you a lot. But if you're living in this, pure rule of economic forces and hyper reality, then that's not as much of a something for you to be concerned about. And a lot of what Keith is saying about the Purple Tribe is primarily concerned. The thing that unifies them is economic interest, right? That's the thing. That's why they're moderates. That's why they're moderate on all these issues. They're primarily concerned about economic security and economic advancement. And so, for the security part, they'll take some social democratic ideas, and for the economic advancement part, they'll take some libertarian conservative ideas. But ultimately, it's an entirely economic class orientation, which is completely abstracted from any sort of real existence. And I think that's the kind of interesting thing that you're pointing out here. And then also, if this is true, then it means for the first time in an industrialized Western society, something like a communist revolution might actually happen. Logos.
I think there's one interesting thing to point out from the purple. One thing that I've seen pointed out quite a bit on Twitter after the election, I saw an interesting ad video by this person that ran in a what was a red district, but I think the person that ran in there like impeached Trump or something, and so they got lost in the primary, and the Blues decided, hey, we might actually be able to win this one, and so they allowed this candidate to run or whatever, allowed, I don't know, and I watched this candidate's ad, Perez something or other, and basically her ad was kind of interesting because, as Keith pointed out, she hit all the moderate notes. She's pro-choice, she is anti-gun control, and to your point, Todd, she's talking about economic advancement, but it was in a very, very rural sense because for the counties she was speaking about, um, this is in a Washington or Oregon district somewhere, and I've heard that in these districts that rely on like forestry and stuff like that, there's a big brouhaha that happened around Salem 2-3 years ago, where Salem was trying to heavily regulate forestry due to climate change issues and stuff like that, and it was national news because the state house members, they knew they were outvoted on the issue, and so they just fled to other states. And they had to actually used police and bounty hunters to, like, find these people in other states and get them back for quorum to vote on these issues they're going to lose on, to heavily regulate the forestry service. And a lot of the issues this Democrat that was kind of a purple candidate ran on was basically like, stop regulating the forestry service so much. Like, our economies depend on this sort of thing. And the other thing she ran on was like, let's get more internet to these more rural communities so their businesses can develop in the same way that these urban businesses are developing. So it's like, yeah, this is definitely like an economic message, but it's not your classical left economic message of like, let's raise the minimum wage, down with capitalism or whatever else. It was very much a rural, we need better infrastructure. We need to stop heavily regulating forestry purely at the expense of rural districts if they have no alternatives. Message that I thought was really interesting because it was this purple tribe message, but it wasn't like this really broad airsats purple tribe message like you were pointing out, Todd. At least this is one example where this was very much a local, real world driven, here are issues kind of message. And it just turns out that the Republican Party thought they were going to win on the pro-Trump thing, and because the previous red person got ousted in the primary because they impeached Trump or whatever, and it turned out these issues won the day in that area in a big way. So I understand some of what you're saying, but I think there are some interesting examples that should also be looked at too.
Okay, let me rephrase the point, Logos. The reason why I said it was airsats is because throughout none of the normal things that motivated human behavior in the past, and even in most of the world today, motivate modern U.S. politics. That's why it's airsats. I mean, nobody, because if they're talking about relation, so on the one hand, there's these cultural issues that the rest of the world can't understand, but even with regards to the economy, it's in relationship to these capital structures that never existed before. I mean, if you were to tell somebody in like the year 1000 in, medieval Italy, oh, the key to your economic development is getting the internet, they'd be like, what are you talking about? They wouldn't even understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's why I think some of that's interesting. I guess I just wanted to point out how rooted her message was also in the forestry concerns that were local to those area, because all throughout human history we've lived off the land, farming, forestry, wood, things like that. And I'd say a good third of her ad was just focused on those kinds of issues and grievances. And when you've got a 5-minute ad, I think it was somewhere about, and a chunk of it that big was just focused on those kinds of issues, I don't think they're fully dead. I think, like you're saying, that some of the stuff's getting subsumed in like technological culture and whatnot. But on the other hand, I think some of it's still alive. And I think what I want to watch is for future elections to see if candidates look at her success in flipping this district and see, okay, if we really tailor messages that are that local to our constituency, and if we follow through, if we win, can that be uh, a strategy for like locking things down, at least in the House going forward? Senate and the presidency are doomed. The government's doomed because that's going to be an urban-rural divide where you're like relying on population centers. And that, I think, owing to your point, is where ersatz politics wins the day, because you just can't make a message that appeals to like these urban-rural demographics that are so completely different. I think where there's hope in politics, it's going to be in the House races.
Right, and I will say to your point, Logos, the example you gave was a rural district. It wasn't like a city or suburban district.
Right.
Right. All right, Keith.
Well, talking about the economic issues, I think that one thing we may have seen in this election is that economic issues are starting to match cultural issues in terms of their importance in elections, and not just on a very general level. But I think that the fact that we see that the divisions between rich and poor, between social classes, is the widest now it's been at any point in 100 years. When we're now basically in a gilded age. The digital revolution has pretty much produced the same effect as the industrial revolution. On one hand, it's lifted some people's living standards considerably, but on the other hand, you have a system of class polarization that's associated with it. I think that's really starting to find its way into mainstream politics as well, and I think that was aggravated by the impact of the pandemic. The economic issues really do matter to a lot of people. It's more and more. Bread and butter issues are important, and I do think for this purple tribe I'm talking about, economic issues are at least as important as social issues, and also there are different types of economic issues. Like the one reason I think that inflation didn't dominate the election is because that's not the only economic issue people have. Some people are concerned about inflation, people with large families and high grocery bills, people who travel a lot by car and have high gas bills, but other people are concerned about student loan debt. Other people are concerned about the cost of health care, the cost of health insurance. Some people are concerned about the cost of housing. All of those are economic issues too. So there's lots of different economic issues, and some of these Democrats are perceived of rightfully, wrongfully as being better on, and Republicans are rightfully, wrongfully perceived as being better on others. So economic issues were important. I think that did drive a lot of people's voting, but I think the economic issue varied considerably. When it comes to the cultural issues too, one thing that I've noticed is that the more fractious American society becomes, the more culture war tribes there seem to be. I mean, we've got the two big meta tribes or coalitions of tribes, the blue and the red. But it seems like more and more you find people who don't fit the stereotypes there. For example, nowadays you see more Hispanic Republicans, you see more Black Republicans, you see more gay Republicans. You see people who are who don't really fit a lot of the ideological stereotypes, but also there's just a wider collection of interests out there. There's a wider collection of cultural groups. There's a wider collection of value systems. For example, on the far left, you see more and more people embracing, say, the transgender thing. On the right, you see more and more people getting into conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff. And then you see a backlash against all that. You see people from different places saying, wait a minute, all this is just going way overboard. So we're now starting to see different, more and more tribes emerge, and then different tribes have the effect of canceling each other out in elections, just like economic factions have the effect of canceling each other out. For every anti-inflation voter, there's an anti-student loan debt voter. For every gender affirming whatever, child care or whatever, for every voter against that, there's somebody voting against gun violence. So it's and then you have more and more people who don't feel like they have a home in any of this stuff. And then a lot of those are migrating towards the purple tribe. Another thing about the economic issues is that we have a lot of people now who are coming of age who grew up during the meltdown of 2008. Somebody who was, say, 8 years old then, right, they voted for the first time in the last couple of elections, first or second time in the last couple of elections. So we have a lot of people coming of age now for whom economic issues were always primary issues, who have no clue about, the post-war prosperity, or the fact that in the post-war period we had a working class where large sectors of it could live like an upper middle class. They have no memory of that. They're used to a world where housing in large cities cost $3,000 a month or for rent. That to them, that's normal. They're used to a world where people live at home at age 30 with their parents because they can't afford to live on their own. They have no clue about that was ever not the norm. It's like Todd was saying about the going back in time to the people in the medieval world and saying, well, you got to have the internet if you want to be successful. And to them that would be like saying, well, beam us up, Scotty. And I think a lot of people now are I think this is back to what I was saying about the generational change, but there's a generation coming up now that has no clue about life before the internet, that never lived without the internet, and who there are people now who don't remember September 11th. There are people in the service now, in the military now, who don't remember September 11th. To me, I'm 56. To me that's inconceivable, but not to them. So I do think we're in the verge of seeing a generational changing of the guard.
All right, guys, it's about time to wrap up. Logos, do you have any what's your final thoughts?
I don't know if I can be eloquent here on this one. I just think we're screwed. I don't know what else to say.
All right, yeah, I'll just say we can't really move the needle much anymore on social issues because of what I said earlier. Final thoughts, Keith?
I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next 20 years. Is there going to be any stabilization process that takes place? Are things going to continue to become more and more polarized in every category, socially, economically, culturally? Are we going to continue to see increased political violence? Who knows?
All right, so we have some chats I think are interesting. One, of course, is a super chat, so we'll have RA for 5 English pounds. Keep up the great work. Thank you. But one chat that I thought was interesting, one comment that was interesting was by M. Either there was funny business or abortion is more important to voters than being able to afford food and fuel. Either way, a massive black pill. Any thought on that comment, Logos?
Yeah, I think it could be a mix of both. I've been following what's going on in Arizona. I saw something on Twitter. Don't know how true it is. I'll have to look more into it later. That said that in Maricopa County, like 48% of printers, voting machines, and whatever in the county were having massive issues on election day. Now, that's true. That's interesting because they were put on notice like after the 2020 election, and they got new equipment and they had like a mandate to get your stuff in order before the next election. And the fact that they had one job after the first election, build public trust, there's like a mandate to do it, and they wait till election day and half the county like screws up, and it's the county that was most like, concerning, is huge, especially since all this stuff went down on election day, which they know when most Republicans vote. So if that's the case, that could be an interesting case for voter suppression. Following that with interest. I can't say that happened everywhere. I don't know that I've seen such interesting patterns all over the place, but yeah, it's like I said earlier, right? Like if this is where the Republicans kind of dug their own grave, right? If daddy government isn't responsible for your economic condition, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Then I'm just not surprised if people eventually say, you know what? Sure, abortion's the issue of the day. Then we'll just see how much of our bodies the state can regulate, or whatever the talking point is. So yeah, could be a mixture of both things. I'm waiting to see. It's all blackpilling.
Any thoughts on that comment, Keith?
I'm a little skeptical that there's really that much cheating going on in the elections to the point that it significantly influences the outcome of elections. I mean, there are individuals that cheat. There may be some systemic cheating on the margins, but the idea that there's this vast, Russia Gate or Stop the Steal conspiracy to steal elections, that I tend to be a little bit more suspicious of. That's not to say that there's never cheating, but how pervasive it is, I'm not quite so sure about. As far as the abortion thing, that's is and always has been a hot button issue in U.S. politics, and I think it's clear that the pro-choice side really came out for the Democrats, particularly young women, in this particular election. On one hand, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe with the Dobbs decision, on one hand they handed a gift to the right, to the pro-choice, pro-life right, in terms of the ruling, but they also handed an immediate electoral gift to the Democrats, because the Democrats, I think, came out en masse. In fact, exit polls showed that the two biggest issues in this election were inflation and abortion. So I think that the messaging that the Republicans had, the Democrats are the party of inflation, I think that was canceled out by the Democrats' messaging that the Republicans are the party of the Dobbs decision. So they kind of balanced each other out, and maybe that's what pushed things to the center. But yeah, that's the abortion thing is extremely important to a lot of Democratic voters.
All right, everybody, that's it for today. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Logos. This is Ty Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.